Corsair today is launching two new cases, the $180 570X Crystal with tempered glass paneling and RGB LED fans on a multi-function controller, and the 270R, a mid-tower for $70 or $60 without the window. This review contains thermal benchmarking at various RPMs, dBA, noise level testing, and our new ambient case temp metric alongside the usual ease of installation and quality review, and that's for both cases. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by AMD's RX 470 video card, which we've declared to be the best price performance value in the less than $200 video card market. The link in the description below lands to a couple of RX 470s. And speaking of AMD, Corsair has adopted their naming scheme. I know, haha, everyone's made that joke. But seriously, they have the 460X that we spoke about at PAX. Now there's the 570X and then there's the 270R. Those are the new cases. And for the run through, we're starting with the Corsair Radeon 570X, which is a comment that will probably confuse someone next year when the 570 exists. In this custom animation that Gamers Nexus made, we're showing an explosion of the 570X's tooling and paneling. The left, right, and front center panels are all made of tempered glass measuring 4 millimeters thick, all attached to the chassis structure with 4 thumb screws per panel. Gaps in the paneling make for an interesting visual decision, exposing the underlying structure and relying on about a 0.6-inch gap on the sides of the front intake for breathing for the fans. Put that to the test in the thermal benchmark. That small space is compensated for, in theory, with 3 120mm RGB fans in the front, which we tested and found to max out at around 1500 to 1600 RPM. Each fan has 2 cables. One routes to the rear side hub, the other routes to the motherboard directly. The motherboard 3-pin connector provides the power for the motor, while the 4-pin connector to the hub provides communication with yet another hub. This one actually is more an SP RGB controller. And then 3 more cables bridge this controller with the front panel buttons, providing a handful of colors, speeds, and modes that are manually toggleable through 3 buttons on the front or on the back side of the case. In this regard, the RGB fans are weaker than some of the immediate competition. Thermaltake's new Ring fans, although sort of plagued with clumsy software, are more configurable than what you'll get with the Corsair SP RGB fans, and the same is true for NZXT's fans, the Air fans. They just have more options through software. But we'd be shocked if Corsair weren't working on a similar solution already. To Corsair's credit, they are one of the only vendors shipping with the RGB fans installed in a case, in this class anyway. NZXT and Thermaltakes are both presently aftermarket solutions. The 570X is Corsair's effort to attack both current case trends in one go, tempered glass and RGB lights, and in some ways the LEDs feel a little bit unnecessary, but I suppose they're what sells today. The extra controllers and LEDs add to cost, obviously, and the case would be perfectly suitable with just the glass at a price reduction. Regardless, let's talk ease of installation. The enclosure uses a split-level motherboard tray, which is something I haven't talked about since probably the NZXT H series cases, and this allows you to theoretically more easily route the 8-pin EPS power cables. It's got a couple of cutouts on the top. Actually, it's sort of one long cutout because the tray basically goes up and then over. And in the sort of main spot where you find an EPS connector, back left corner, there's a large cutout. The smaller parts don't really fit the cables that I had, which consequently are actually from a Corsair power supply. You could split the 8-pin in half into 2 4-pins and wiggle it through. So it's an area where an extra 1 millimeter or even half a millimeter of extra depth in that hole would allow for the cable to fit through completely without issue. And it is a small gripe, but at this point it is one of the things that Corsair could improve on. Installation of the board is easy though. It's a larger case with a lot of room, and that means plenty of working area, but the PSU shroud isn't removable. The 270R does, however, have a front cover that prevents cables from sneaking into visibility, and the 570X doesn't really prevent the cables from slipping out into the case where you can see them. The 570X has a brilliant SSD installation system and is actually my favorite feature of the case and the best SSD installation I've seen yet. No screws are required. It's a spring-loaded trap door that locks the SSD into place, quick and painless and impossible to screw up. The 270R, like the 570X, also mounts its SSD sleds to the rear side of the motherboard tray, but uses a more traditional set of screws to hold it all in place. And then the expansion slot screws are a little annoying to access in these cases. They're not a straight shot and could be fixed by cutting out some of the material on the left side of the frame or by exposing the screws through the back of the case. Even Rosewell gets this right with the Coleman, or more appropriately their supplier Jonesbow gets it right. NZXT also gets this right. Both solutions, unlike Corsair's, make it easy to deal with larger video cards like MSI's Gaming X. Again, not a huge deal, but also it is the small things that count at this point because most of the big stuff was done right and has been done right on these sort of name brand cases for quite some time now. Cable management on each case is pretty similar, by which I mean largely unimaginative. The 570X is the only one that's a bit different. It has a cable management shroud on the back side of the case. That would be the right side with the glass panel. That shroud is secured by 2 thumb screws. It hides, in theory, the 24-pin and any other cables that snake up the middle channel of the case and out into the motherboard area. And it's a huge pain in the ass to use, that cable management shroud. So there's not quite enough depth there to accommodate a, for example, braided or sleeved set of cables like Corsair's own 24-pin sleeved cables that we have with the Corsair RM whatever power supply we use for case testing. It just barely fits that. So that is a bit of a problem. I think that could be done better. It took 2 people to screw that thing back down because the cables barely fit in there with the whole bundle all tied up. And if I were working on it alone, I would have just left the thing out because it was not perfect. So NZXT, I think, has Corsair beat on this front in cable management. You'll hear me talk about that again in a moment. But at least it's an attempt. Corsair's starting to try and do something new with cable management. I just don't think that was the right thing for this particular case. Something much simpler like the plastic cable clamps on NZXT's S340 Elite or Velcro on the Fantex cases would be more accommodating to thicker configurations when working with cables that sort of stack atop each other, and it'd be a bit less intricate in terms of the manufacturing. In this case, that's a good thing. Besides, the sleeved cables look good, and you're probably going to have sleeved cables if you're building in a $180 enclosure with a glass panel on the right side. Corsair may have NZXT routinely defeated in cooling performance. Again, we'll see that soon. But NZXT does reign king with cable management from the S340 onward. That said, we do like Corsair's added cable pass-throughs on the 270R for its PCIe headers. This is something that we asked for on the 600C, and it does allow direct access to the GPU, so good on them for adding that. We finally updated our case testing platform from the ancient 3570K bench, which is the first bench that Gamers Nexus officially built as a standalone component bench solution. So we have a new one. It's detailed in the article linked in the description below, along with all of the methodology if you want to read about what components were used, coolers, all that stuff. It is down there in the link. And the fact that we're moving to a new case bench does mean that all previous results are not comparable to these. So you can't look at previous results and compare CPU or GPU thermals with the ones from this system because they are completely different parts. And in this case, we've also slightly overclocked the 6700K by about 10%. In terms of the other methodology items that you should know if you haven't seen these videos before, we measure ambient temperature in the test environment with 2 thermocouples. Both are K-type thermocouples. They attach to a thermocouple reader. They log every second. We use AIDA64 to monitor the CPU temperature every second. And then we use AIDA also for the GPU temperature with GPU-Z for validation and run some automated tests in the background that completely self-execute, so there's no chance for human error. And then when all that data is collected, we create a delta value, so you get your delta T over ambient, and that's what tells us, because ambient can fluctuate from second to second, it gives us a good look at case performance when accounting for ambient. One other thing to note, our methodology is accurate to a point of plus or minus 0.5 Celsius, and again, complete testing methodology in the description below. Let's start with the CPU temperatures. The 570X at 1550-ish RPM is unsurprisingly the best cooled enclosure on the newly assembled case bench, and that's because we've only got the cases that you see here, which are largely competitors in the tempered glass arena, or at least the large window side panel arena. It's large and it's got 3 intake fans, the 570X, and that positions it atop these charts with its max fan RPM for 50.2 Celsius delta T over ambient, or about 2.6 idle. Dropping the 570X's fan speed to 1050 RPM increases our temperature by nearly 2 Celsius load, but the noise benefit is mostly worth it here. The temperature gain, strictly looking at the CPU, is not significant to the CPU's performance, but it is a significant factor when considering GPU performance. Moving on to Corsair's $60 to $70 case, the 270R at 1300 RPM max fan speed produces a 52.8 C load temperature for the CPU. 270R only has 2 fans, one in the front, one in the rear, and uses the most basic intake exhaust setup that has existed for ages. An RPM change to roughly 1050 increases our temperature by about 2C again. And NZXT's S340 Elite is considerably worse than the 570X when both are at their max fan RPMs. This isn't necessarily significant for the CPU, but as I've said, that will prove useful to look at when considering GPU boost performance. We'll look at that in a moment. Regardless, the CPU temperature is about 55.8 Celsius load, resultant of NZXT's decision to use strictly exhaust fans in the top and the rear of the S340 Elite. They're doing this for dust reasons, but it's really not good for thermal reasons. Rosewell's Coleman isn't much better, and that's with 4 fans, but not all fans are made equal, obviously, and Rosewell's are more suffocated in the front of the case than the others. But then there's the Inwin 303, which we tested with its stock configuration, that is to say 0 fans. With our new test bench, it's overclock and our axial fan GPU rather than the radial blower fan. The Inwin 303 heats up rapidly and incinerates components without any of its intake fans present because it ships with none, and that's what we tested. The CPU is hitting 100C, GPU thermal throttles at 81C, and that's when looking at non-delta values. The case is obviously best paired up with a fan or 2 if you purchase it, so when considering the price, $70 to $75, you've got to count the price of 2 fans. Moving on to GPU temperatures, we see at the top, Rosewell's Coleman leverages its rear exhaust fan to help dispense some of the heat that collects around the backplate of the Gaming X. This brings the Coleman's temps down to 49.19 Celsius, showing the advantage of a dual fan axial cooling solution in a standard ATX case. Our previous case bench used a blower fan and reference cooler, which really suffered in some scenarios, but it was also useful in others, like small boxes. We used Firmark for these burn-ins, which abuses the VRMs to generate significant heat. This test approach means that it is important for cases to be able to dissipate the heat emission that radiates off of the back of the PCB, which an exhaust fan supports. That's what you're seeing here. Anyway, with the fixed GPU fan speed and Firmark burning the VRMs while Prime 95 is going on, we see a 49 Celsius delta T for the Coleman. 570X, the Corsair case that we're reviewing, is about 51C. 270R, also reviewing, is at about 52C. And the S340 Elite is at about 54C. We're seeing a 3 Celsius delta between the 570X at 1550 and 1050 RPM at about 21 to 22 Celsius roughly for ambient temperatures, and you'll get an idea of the GPU diode temperature in a cool house, or add your own if you want a more accurate measurement. Our next chart is ambient case temperature. We decided to add this chart after running extreme burn-in scenarios on the EVGA FTW cards, which we'll be publishing this week. In those tests, we found that an increasing ambient temperature of around 40 Celsius had a significant impact on the VRM cooling in a way that wasn't reflected with a 22 Celsius open air temperature. To this end, we've learned that ambient case temperature, not just diode temperatures, are important to the cooling of components, which can only be measured by direct thermocouples and not by software. Again, like the VRMs or VRAM. The 570X blows the S340 Elite away with a 10 Celsius difference in case ambient temperature, at least where we measure it. And as we've learned with EVGA, that's a significant difference. Efficiency loss and thermal headroom limitations on the card come into play at this point. 270R does well, the Coleman is okay, but it's still suffocated a bit by the intake. And we position our case ambient probe, just for notes, about 3 inches from that intake fan in the front. So that is between the CPU, GPU fan, and the case fans. It's sort of triangulated between the 3 of them. That's also a hotspot for the S340 Elite, which we'll soon be reviewing in a separate video. Moving on to noise briefly, these tests are taken with decibel meter at 20 inches from the front of the case. The noise floor of the room is about 26 dBA, and we take a delta to get our numbers on this chart. Keep in mind that decibels are logarithmic, so the delta noise is not calculated the same way as temperatures. It's not subtractive. These tests are conducted with the GPU fan at 50%, CPU fan at 1100 RPM, which is the speed it uses for all our tests, and the 270R at 1050 RPM is the quietest, thanks to its usage of only 2 fans, with one stuck behind the front panel that eats noise. S340 Elite is next and about equal to the 270R when its 2 fans are also at 1050 RPM. We then move to the 570X at 1050, see a 35 dBA output, pretty similar to the first 2, and Rosewell's Coleman and its 4 fans at 36 dBA thanks to a low RPM. That's followed by the 270R at 1300 RPM, or 36.6 dBA. S340 Elite runs louder at 1300 RPM, and part of that is because both of its fans are directly against the top and rear panels, and they're more exposed to the outside in that way. They're also just a bit louder at 38.1 dBA. The 570X at 1550 RPM is nearly a perceptual 2x increase in volume from the 270R at 1050 RPM, but is still manageable. For reference, the average phone's text tone is about 80 decibels for max volume based on our loose tests. there you have it. And conversation, normal conversation at about 3 feet is somewhere around 65 decibels. Let's start the conclusion with the 270R. This is the easier case to discuss. 270R at $60 price point for a non-windowed variant is one of the easiest pickups at its price. $70 alternative starts to enter into competition with the long-treasured NZXT SD40, the Cooler Master Box, and the Fractal Define S. The Inwind 303 sort of counts, but you'd have to buy a few fans, so that instantly puts the 303 closer to the 400C in price. We like the 270R even at $70, where the competition is tougher. It's a good solution. The 270R cools adequately on all fronts and is relatively quiet even at its higher RPMs. There's a good chance that your components will be louder anyway, and it's also easy to build in, which is one of the most important things with a cheap case, other than the small gripes with expansion slot screws. NZXT does a better job with cable management in its $70 S340 and $100 S340 Elite than both of these, but Corsair's case does better with cooling, so to each their own advantages. And then for the harder one to review, the 570X, I'm not sure what to think of it really from an aesthetic standpoint. I normally stick to testing and data. It's a lot easier for me to work with. But this is the kind of thing where you got to look at it and decide for yourself. I've asked several people what they think. I have heard from Andrew, the man behind the camera, that it sort of looks like a modern building construction style, which, yeah, it sort of does. I've heard two opinions on the LEDs. They are unnecessary and they are necessary. And personally, it does sort of look like Corsair just was like, let's slap a bunch of glass to a frame. And that's what they did. But, you know, if that looks good or not is up to you, not up to me. So I'll leave that part to you guys. As far as the performance, the noise, the temperatures are all more than adequate for the 570X, and they're fine on the 270R. Really no big complaints there. The Dark Base 900 Be Quiet's case comes to mind as sort of a direct competitor, at least in price to this, the cheaper one anyway, $200-ish. And then you could also look at Corsair's older 760T if you don't like the tempered or the glass on all sides and you'd rather have something like an acrylic or polycarbonate. Then those large full window options that are more typical in their design would be a good thing to consider at $160 rather than $180 for the glass. Thermaltake's P3 and P5. Worth looking at in a similar price range if you want something wall mounted, something a bit unique. And there are plenty of other options out there. So plenty to work with. The 570X is pretty easy to build in, same with the 270R. The 270R I think is the easier one to recommend here because it is a decent deal. And as far as the 570X, you're dealing with a couple of controllers. One of them is a dumb, quote-unquote dumb controller, which is what handles your RGB functions, your modes for the fans, and the speeds for the fans. The first unit we received had issues with lighting not really working. Actually, none of the modes worked, but the replacement controller did resolve those issues, and Corsair assures me that they've never seen this before, which of course we hear all the time, but in this case I do actually kind of believe that because I looked around and I couldn't find anything. So I think that was a one-off issue. I wouldn't really worry about that too much, and obviously if it is an issue for some reason, they should replace it under normal warranty. But when it does work, it's okay. If you don't want software to control your fans, I guess that's the way to do it. So as always, article for more. If you want more, it's linked in the description below. Subscribe for more coverage. We have plenty this week, EVGA's cards being a major item to talk about. And Patreon link to the postal video to help us out directly. I'll see you all next time. For case testing, it just barely fits that. So